It is something what I call embedded research. It's very similar to embedded journalism. We have to apply for it for access to a restricted area. We have a predefined time schedule. There is a kind of a window of opportunity that opened and closes for us as outsiders. There are explicit no-go areas, and there is more or less, and in general, agenda setting by others. We have guided visits in a bigger group with somebody else. So embedded research implies a willingness of subordination for a privileged view and insight. If we look on how research is done, there are different phases, we know, and if we talk about embedded research as a concept, two phases are very crucial. We have to add. Normally we ask a question, where there's a kind of a working proposition. We go there, data finding, analysis, dissemination, under conditions of embedded research. It is crucial, how do we get in, and also how do we get out? How do we get in means we have to ask an appropriate question to get in. And how to get out means there will be some answers that are accepted and others not. And if it's an unacceptable answer, perhaps we cannot proceed with our field study in China. To give you an example, for example, we could be interested in the general conditions of the Kazakh people in Xinjiang, but we will not find partners. But we could find partners if we reframe our question into something like could we improve the health status of Kazakh herders? And we can make field work together with Chinese academics, but of course there also will be some answers that are not acceptable politically in a way. For example, if we say mobility to sustain mobility for Kazakh people is very crucial, but if the political context is that now all the Kazakh nomads have to be settled down, of course, these kind of founded solutions for healthcare that are based on a concept of some kind of a national mobility, of course, are political sensitive. Or if we think about something like the recent discussion about Uyghur people, there is no way in if we ask, are there any concentration camps in China? But of course, we could reframe it and say, does concentration camp or vocational education and training centers exist in China? But of course, an answer becomes sensitive if we say, in fact, we found their concentration camps. How do we get in? Is of course something is closely related to how our Chinese partners get into the field. So if we want to understand how we get in, we could also observe how they get in and what are the social roles and what are their resources to conduct a field study in China. And something what is very crucial here, that of course we both, and the way we are walking, how Hansen has called it, in the footsteps of the Communist Party. Central leaders are going down for inspection, and we as foreigners, together with Chinese researchers, are also going down, not for inspection, political inspection, but for conducting field studies. So the situation is very similar for them and for us in politically trained situation. People used to reduce themselves as data givers to the official data grabbers. So what is so interesting is that, of course, how do they get in? It's not primarily, of course, as an academic, but in the social role as a consultant. It is the local government who ask a question, who has some need for consultancy, some need for expertise. So, and they hire academics for advice or advisory. So advisory is the interface of science and politics at the sub-central level in China. If we want to assess our possibilities of fieldwork, we have to look closely into these scenarios of advisory in this clearly social hierarchy between a principal, the local government, and the agent, that is the scientist, or that is ourselves. So consultancy, I would say, is the main interface of social science or public health and politics in China. But of course, in a clear and vulnerable hierarchy, so for us in a vulnerable position, because we are hired, we are the agent, and we are working on request of the local government. This is the form of embeddedness. They say what we could and what we should do, what should be the outcome. So the problem is how, if we want to have some kind of access, if we want to do field work, how do we deal with this kind of self-restrictions and self-concessions during entrance and access, as I said, how to get in, how to get out. Of course, we should keep a professional attitude and speak out the condition of embedded research. So we have to contextualize our research. We have to exemplify the hierarchies we are working in. We have to address and the positionalities and resonance in ourselves. Only if we are doing that, we can give a kind of a broader picture, what we really have seen and what are the conditions and what is the situation of research and also the situation, how people live there. Then the research becomes realistic and the documentation is complete. And here, of course, if we are not doing this, of course, then here self-censorship comes in. So we deny that kind of act of subordination. We deny that there is a kind of a reframing of our question. We deny that there is a kind of reposition, that we reposition ourselves in the social role of the consultant. I would argue with a very serious impact. The documentation is incomplete. The perception that is presented is biased. The methodology is simplifying or simplified because a lot of resources and techniques, how did we get answers, is not a part of the research analysis or dissemination. And that's most serious, all the theory that is suggested or worked out by this kind of fieldwork is misleading and dangerous. So this is, of course, something what we should not do, but what we should do, keep the professional attitude and talk about these kind of situation of embeddedness and make explicit what has been implicit or something what others want to hide or keep hidden. So it is uncontested that we need exchange. We want to go there. We want to have access to the primary source. We want to have our own reading. We want to listen and talk to all parts of the society. Tactical modifications or concessions during exit, entrance and exit. So how do we get in, how to get out, are the crucial phases. Enabling our access and pleasing our hosts in China can endanger our academic freedom at that moment when we do not make explicit what was a crucial phase of this field work. So embedded research is fueled, of course, by our need of data, because we need it. We have to go there. This is that kind of need makes us vulnerable for these scenarios of embeddedness and concessions by ourselves. In settings of embedded research and confronted with a regime of censorship, it is crucial to address these modifications as a part of the contextualization and discussion of results, methods, and theories. What has been hidden or implicit during data collection has to be documented and has to be made explicit during analysis and dissemination latest. In an ambivalence with our self-perception as researchers who can say everything and the de facto self-concessions for data during the entrance to the field, self-censorship is, I would argue, a coping strategy of a hidden denial of different stages of embeddedness and subordination. These are my references. Thank you for your attention.
I contributed to the latest number of our journal, an article about Jaroslav Průšek, an exploration in the history of European sinology. Maybe I will ask Tara to show Jaroslav Průšek for a moment so that you have a taste of the person and perhaps the time he lived in. Here we have a rarely seen photo, Jaroslav Průšek in late 1950s, together with Professor Rybka, who was a specialist in ancient Persian literature and a sort of very traditional Orientalist active at Charles University at that time. So you can see this gentleman, impressive gentleman, talking about apparently issues of scholarship, because this was taken during a conference. I think Tara in a few minutes can, or in a minute, can take the picture away so that you see me. I don't have a presentation and I will only talk. Průšek is perhaps known to many of you as a scholar of original insight into modern Chinese literature and Chinese literary modernity, a scholar that was able to break through the cliches of the May 4th movement, of the May 4th idea of modernity, but also of the cliches of his time and the spirit of the society he lived in, because he was active mostly during the socialist Czechoslovakia, living in a mostly totalitarian regime in which censorship and self-censorship was something which was unavoidable. His scholarship is thus, the scholarship he became famous for internationally is thus in stark contrast to the position of a scholar who is working under the conditions of the totalitarian regime. And I perhaps should emphasize that Průšek was not only living in that situation, but he also was very, very much flourishing in that situation. He was a sort of an apparatchik. He is sometimes criticized by other intellectuals in other spheres that he was an apparatchik. He was a person that was well established until 1968 in the system. And also I know from personal reminiscences of people who met Průšek in 1968, and we can read it also in some of his articles published in newspapers. He was also a person that believed in communism. He took communism for his, let's say, the basis for belief for a better society. And this belief was shattered and broken after the Soviet-led invasion in 1968. Working on the article, I decided to read everything Průšek published, even articles written in Czech language, but of course, everything he published in English, and a few pieces in German and French. I struggled with German, I managed French. It was very interesting because you could see that his very original ideas make only a minor part of his production, and that great part of his production is very much embedded in the ideology of his time. This is interesting to think about, because it is this minor part which provides a real insight, interesting new ideas, which are still inspiring today, 70 years after he first published on the topic. It inspires cutting-edge research in modern Chinese literary modernity, while the rest is forgotten. There is, in this story of balancing between this ideological cliches of his time and real insight and innovative scholarship, there are, of course, many question marks. And I don't want to ask a question whether Průšek was forced by the environment to obey the ideological cliches, or whether he simply he ascribed or he used the strategy of self-censorship to protect his students and to protect his institution, etc., which is the prevailing discourse among Czech sinologists. He just was not, self-censorship was crucial because he wanted to promote sinology. I don't ask this question. I rather move the question in a different direction, because I think that when we compare his different writings, we also can see different value in scholarship, in contribution to new knowledge production. And we can just see whether it was self-conscious censorship or whether it was interiorized ideology. Průšek simply failed in some part of his research, failed his promised goal of providing scientific, as he said, objective truth. Yes, and this makes me think about the whole complexity of environment a scholar is inside, including ourselves today, but we don't have the distance we have now when thinking about somebody writing 50 years ago. And that there is no dividing line between pure scholarship and the ideas and ideologies we are surrounded with, and that scholarship in social sciences and humanities are always part of the broader environment, including the political environment. You just cannot escape it. This is what shapes us, what shapes our work, and what we also, in various degrees, shape or participate in our work. So to make it short, I would just say that the lesson I learned from reading Průšek in detail and reading many things, most of the people will never read again, because some of these writings really don't deserve wasting time on them, that it is impossible for a scholar, even in his scholarship, to escape broader issues of politics which impact on him. And for me, it is a lesson that as a scholar, I should not avoid politics, and I should also think about politics and political implications on my work and of my work. So this would just be a shorter remark in the context of our discussion. And as I said in the beginning, I think self-censorship is only part of it, because the self-censorship may be conscious, but it may also be something which is interiorized and subconscious. And as scholars, we should somehow fight with all the preconceived knowledge and pre-understandings, because we try to open up new visions of understanding and knowledge. And this is our task, even though, at least myself, we are not perhaps such giants as Průšek was in his time. Thank you for your attention.
Yeah, so today I'm going to offer some conceptual reflections aimed at enhancing reflexivity in the field of China studies. And at the heart of my discussion will be the emic and etic distinction and the question of positionality in China studies. Please allow me to briefly preface my talk with a couple of observations. They kind of echo what Sascha and Olga have already said. Since the founding of the PRC, the ruling party has never granted Chinese academia any meaningful autonomy. And this lack of academic freedom affects Western scholarship on China too. So for example, I'm thinking of the conscious or unconscious depoliticization of research puzzles, adjustments to research approaches to accommodate Chinese partner organizations, or the selective presentation of research findings in public talks and publications. Now, I find it problematic that the question how Western China scholars deal with this politically circumscribed access to China, I find it problematic because it's not sufficiently discussed in the academic and public discourse. And therefore, I contend that there's generally a lack of transparency about the conditions of China-related research. Now, the former US diplomat, Mark Reedy, has furthermore pointed out the problem of self-censorship in a quote. He points out that knowledgeable individuals have long understood the professional consequences of coming out as overly critical of the CCP. And ironically, those with the most knowledge have typically faced the highest incentive to temper their views given the importance of China access and ties for professional success. Now you could say, okay, this is the view of an American diplomat, why should I care? The reason why I should care is that academic research on the topic of self-censorship, I think of the Greitens Truex study, but also Teng Biao's and Klotzbücher et al.'s scholarship all support this critical assessment. Now, in addition, I have also noticed that both in the academic and public discourse, Western scholars frequently give China ontological status and do not really distinguish between what could be termed official China or unofficial China. And with official China, I refer to individuals and organizations under control of the CCP. Unofficial China, on the other hand, represents autonomy seeking in Chinese individuals, groups, and networks. And so to conclude my introductory remarks, I would like to add that very often a given China scholar's own position vis-a-vis the Chinese actors or discourses is often not being critically reflected upon. And in my view, this raises the question how we can better address this conundrum. Now, I think one possible solution is to borrow from social anthropology. And here I'm thinking of Marvin Harris. He has distinguished between what he calls an emic and an etic perspective. Now, again, an emic perspective comes from within the social group under observation. Etic, on the other hand, signifies the views and concepts of outsiders observing and analyzing a relatively distant place, culture, society, or political system. Now, to be absolutely clear here, I don't believe in a hierarchy of these two views. However, Harris himself points out that actually the validity of scientific results ultimately depends on the consensus of the community of observers, independent of the distinctions that the actors themselves consider appropriate. So that's why the etic viewpoint is really important, not because it's the correct view, but it is very important. It's the outsiders basically making these distinctions. So let me jump right in and apply this to the case of contemporary China. So how can we make sense of these two different types of perspectives? Now, I have noticed that in the emic and oral, it's very important, oral Chinese language discourse, my interlocutors have often used the term tijine and tijy. These terms can be translated as inside the system and outside the system. And in my book, I've used the two terms establishment and anti-establishment. You could also use the terms official China, unofficial China. Now you have to bear in mind that these self-ascribed categories are not to everyone's liking. So some Chinese intellectuals, also civil society practitioners, and other professionals, they would like to overcome this dichotomy, which they find overly polarizing. And that's why there is actually a third camp, at least, we can think about it that way, a gray area between official China, unofficial China, for example, Chinese citizens who only pay lip service to the CCP. And this kind of position could be called the trans-establishment. Now, this is where it's getting really interesting, because it's very difficult to capture the viewpoints of such protagonists. And this is because if we think about the scholarship of Timur Kuran, for example, there's the problem of preference falsification. People may not say what they think. Or Orlando Figes, he has written about the Stalinist period in the Soviet Union and talks about the speaking in whispers. Or more recently, Wang Yuhua has described Chinese citizens who are silent dissidents. They actually reject the Xi regime, but they would not admit that in the public discourse for obvious reasons. So having lived and worked in China for more than 8 years, I've met many Chinese elites who fall in this third bracket of the trans-establishment category, but making sense of their viewpoints was not always easy, because they have, in different contexts, engaged in situational leadership and applied what could be termed this onion approach. That's why I've been using these onion pictures. Now, you may wonder how such varied emic viewpoints correspond with the viewpoints of outsiders, and that's the ethic perspective. So in the following, I will juxtapose these three camps on the left side with three camps on the right side. The first camp, which in my view is the largest, are Western academics or practitioners who perceive China primarily through the perspective of the party-sanctioned discourse. And here the primary focus is on official China. There is also a much smaller group of academics and or practitioners who focus on what could be termed unofficial China. And in a way, we can also identify a third group of academics or practitioners who observe both official and unofficial China, as well as their interactions. But I would contend that this is not the majority of scholars, but perhaps their numbers exceed those who exclusively focus on unofficial China. Now, I should add that this is my arguably subjective view of the field of contemporary Chinese studies after having observed it for more than 25 years. And I'm also mindful that not everyone on this call will agree with this way of representing the emic and ethic camps, but that's fine, as this input is aimed at kickstarting a discussion. And I would invite you to interpret this heuristic device based on your own specific insights and experiences. And I think as a community of scholars, we can deconstruct and reconstruct this heuristic device as we see fit. That's why we're having this dialogue. And so finally, I'd like to conclude with three leading questions, which I think can be useful for our discussion, maybe, hopefully. So based on the ideas I presented today, what would you consider the downsides of perceiving China primarily through the perspective of the party-sanctioned discourse? And given what I just highlighted, how can China experts deal with the challenge of preference falsification? This phenomenon of speaking in whispers, which might now become a real issue under Xi Jinping, and the phenomenon of silent dissidence. This is very hard to capture with social science research methods. And what are actually the key disincentives which explain why so few Western scholars research unofficial China? Thank you.
Thank you, Andreas, and also Olga for the presentations. And now I would like to invite, perhaps let's begin ladies first with Olga. Just also if you have, do you want to comment on, raise the questions to Andreas?
Yes, I find it very interesting I still, on one side, I would understand the 体制内、体制外、官方、民间 as this dichotomy, and maybe, I don't know, it's just a remark, a very, very fast remark, whether instead of establishment, anti-establishment, a dichotomy of establishment and non-establishment would not be useful, because then you have a broader group of people. Some of them may be anti-establishment, some of them are simply not speaking through the establishment. So this is a small remark, but I would have a question. How important in considering the issues you summarized in your presentation, the issue of translation and borrowing concepts, well, coming out from different political and social system, how they may make things even more complicated. Because of course we always negotiate between the Chinese language and Chinese environment, how to express it in our languages and through the concepts of our environment. So I wonder whether this issue of translation, reconceptualization, according to our own established ways, would play a role in this distinction you described.
Yeah, both are excellent points. And I'd like to maybe just comment on the second point about translation, which is really interesting. Maybe 10 years ago, I trained a group of Chevening scholars. They were mostly cadres from the Chinese Communist Party, from the Communist Youth League. And this was a 3-week course entirely delivered in Chinese. And I presented the topic of civil society, which is 公民社会 in Chinese. And to my surprise, my trainees all loved it. They were constantly saying that civil society is good, it's useful, and they use this term extensively. And I was thinking, that's strange. That doesn't really correspond with my experiences in China. And over time, I realized actually what they meant by 公民社会, civil society, was good governance. So whenever the Communist Party does something well, the Communist Party is civil society. And then I actually, because I had foreseen that they might have this misunderstanding, I showed them a brief interview that I had conducted with a civil society practitioner in China, who said that the values of the Communist Party and the values of China's civil society are not the same. They're not the same. And that's when they realized, they said, so do you agree with him? And I said, well, this is an interesting question, isn't it? And then they got really angry. And in terms of the translation that then happened, they said, okay, let's maybe in the coming days, let's talk less about China. Let's talk more about the UK and Germany. But then I responded to them, in Chinese, we say, 用共产党的钱做共产党的事。在英国，我们用英国政府的钱，我们就做英国政府的事。And they didn't like it, but they had to kind of comply with it. So the meaning is that sometimes politics does matter, and they try to avoid this discussion about, let's say, different value systems, but I wouldn't let them. But I was told later in not unclear terms that they were rather upset about it. But I thought, like, this is what I should be doing as a scholar, and not let them get away with it, co-opting the language of civil society for the ends of the Chinese Communist Party.
Thank you.
Andreas, do you also have, before we open up the floor, Andreas, do you also have a question to Olga?
Yes, yeah, Olga. I mean, I think Prusek is so interesting because, as you say, he was a child of his time. And would you say it was actually possible for him to avoid the political partisanship? I mean, let's say he wanted to, but if he wanted to, would he have been realistically able to cover the niche?
Yes, this is a good question. Actually, working on him, I tried to avoid it. I also spoke to his former students. Some of them still live in Prague, and they are all very devoted to their master. And they all deny he was an apparatchik. He was, I mean, I go to the archives and I can see what he was. Yeah, they denied he was a Marxist, not Marxist-Leninist ideologist, but that he was a Marxist. They say he was not Marxist, and they just perceive him as a great scholar beyond time and space, pure, bringing pure essence of Chinese, of the values of Chinese culture to them. And they emphasize his knowledge of ancient China. So this is the problem of perception and of recreation of memory. I think I could write an article on memory on the basis of this. I think he could avoid it. He would not be director of the Oriental Institute. Well, this is very easy. Yeah, and there were people, very few, who resisted the temptation and simply were like the recluses of the Chinese past. But at the same time, I very much hesitate to put this issue into discussion, because he was a man of principle and he was a man of courage during the Nazi occupation of Bohemia, or, well, it was not Czechoslovakia at that time. He resisted, and he was really courageous. We again have sources in the archives. So it would be too cheap to say he was just a person that sacrificed his personal integrity, whether to his career or to the noble thing of building up sinology in Czechoslovakia. And I think the problem is that he compromised his critical insight, which he had, and he proved it in his 1950s articles about the individualism and subjectivism as the basis of Chinese literary modernity, a very daring statement. He could do it, but he interiorized the demands of the Cold War divisions. Yeah, so he praised the great leap forward. You know, he didn't say a single word critical of Tingling, whom he very admired as a great woman. But when she was criticized during the anti-rightist campaign, he just kept silent. Yeah, he never wrote anything about it. So I think it's a very complicated issue that goes into psychology. I want to avoid it, but it's an issue of, at certain point, blocking critical insight one is capable of in favor of achieving some noble goals, in this case, not the Oriental Institute, but the future of mankind.